I'm really excited to share some fun research that I did in the world of Microsoft Cloud Services and how we could get a lot more access than I initially thought from some guest access. A quick bit of background about who I am. As the intro alluded to, my background's in physics. I sort of like have transitioned my way over into cybersecurity. Absolutely loving it. I think my mischievous background of doing things I probably shouldn't on computers is starting to serve me well. So I want to introduce this topic to you today in the same way that it got introduced to me, which was as a mystery. So I am lucky enough to work with a number of partners, and one of those partners reached out to me and said, "Hey, I have just had a guest in my Entra environment make a subscription." So this is what they were seeing in their environment. This is a recreation. And they were really confused. And that was because when we looked at the facts about this case, things really weren't adding up. If a user had made a subscription, we would expect them to be able to see some kind of privilege that they had. But when they looked and we looked, all of the obvious signs of where they might be getting this privilege, there was nothing that had been assigned to the user. So they had no group memberships, they had no directory roles, they had no RBAC roles, or any kind of permissions granted, and yet this subscription was somehow created. If all of this is a bit new to you and that you're not quite sure about what all of these terms mean, don't worry, we're going to build everything up from kind of the basics. And yes, this is very much how I felt trying to understand Azure microservices. So on the agenda today, we're going to be getting into the basics of how Azure works, then getting into the weeds and some of the weirder aspects of this, then getting into what was previously undocumented behavior and now is documented on the Microsoft site. What was Microsoft's position on this threat, and then whether we can abuse this. And finally, I'll go over some defense for all you petrified defenders at the end. So, okay, very quickly. Azure Basics. This comes from the Microsoft website about Entra ID. This is how they kind of want you to think about Entra ID at a very high level. It is essentially a identity provider. And you can see that these are the kind of big high-level things. So you can see we can like integrate apps. We can like onboard like different identities, be those like kind of human identities or kind of like non-human kind of workload identities. And you can see we can kind of like integrate things with kind of like our on-prem environments, and then devices just sit over to the side. I'm going to hopefully help you understand devices a little bit better than this. This is all good. I prefer to build things up from the ground up, being the physicist that I am. So this is my kind of crash course of kind of how the basics of Entra ID. So at the heart of things, we have the Entra ID directory. That is what you are going to like go authenticate against. The different kind of security principles that you can have in Entra ID is like users. Those users can also be guests. We're going to get into the distinction between users and guests shortly. Then you can have service principles. These are what our new non-human identities are. So think like applications. It goes a little bit deeper than applications. You can also have like resources, like infrastructure that can have an identity. And then devices, which is probably the weirdest of all the security principles. That's going to be like your actual like endpoints and like laptops and things like that can have identities and can be secured via those identities. So in terms of like basic privileges that these security principles can have, as I mentioned before, they can have like directory roles and RBAC roles. Directory roles allow the security principal to do something to the directory itself. RBAC roles allow them to have like privilege over Azure resources. We're going to get to that in a second. And then finally, you can kind of have like app roles or API permissions, depending on whether you're a user or a security principal. Like really, they're pretty much the same thing under the hood. They're just like kind of permissions that we have when we go query like Microsoft controlled like APIs. So that is like the Entra ID kind of basic privileges. I mentioned Azure resources. These are the things that RBAC roles kind of like typically affect. So let's try and understand the basics of Azure resources. So when we're talking about like Azure resources, we're really talking about like infrastructure that you're going to be deploying in your Microsoft cloud environment. So think like VMs, like databases, like networks, generally like anything like that. Those then kind of get grouped together into resource groups. That's really like kind of a useful organizational tool more than anything. Then those resource groups containing those resources will sit inside of subscriptions. Subscriptions are really your kind of logical container for different Azure resources. So separate subscriptions should be separate from one another in terms of kind of like any kind of cross access from each other. The complexity doesn't quite end there, though. In the above subscriptions, we have management groups, which, as the name suggests, are kind of like a useful construction for when we want to apply management policies across like all of our subscriptions. So we can have like a large amount of kind of nested management groups, but there's always going to be one root management group that all of your organization's subscriptions are going to be like nested within. And then finally, that management group then is tied to your directory. So we can have a bunch of different RBAC roles that affect things. They are scoped either at from anywhere from the top of the management group level all the way down to potential individual like resources, and anywhere in between is where these can be. We can make our own RBAC roles. Here's just an example of some of the different out-the-box privileges. Okay, so this is where hopefully the talk gets a little bit more fun. Now we've got a little bit of an understanding of the basics. Let's get into B2B guests. So I guess one really quick thing I want to touch on, it's like, why the hell would you have a B2B guest versus a user in a special kind of guest group kind of thing? I had this question when I was like digging into this. The real reason is cost saving. So if you were to have the say like vendors or like kind of people outside of your organization that who you needed to give access to, quite often temporary access, if you had to kind of use one of your actual user licenses for them, you know, this could potentially get quite costly. Often these people are coming from environments where they have their own Entra ID associated with their own organization. So you can say, hey, I'm just going to invite you as a guest from your organization, from your own Entra ID directory into mine, and then you don't have to pay for like one of your seats being occupied in terms of your licensing agreement. But then to understand how that's like working under the hood, our user is going to be authenticating against their home directory, and then they are going to like get an ID token, which they then use to like federate into your, what I'm calling the like resource tenant. It's not just my terminology. This is how Microsoft calls the two different tenants. So the home tenant, that's where they're coming from of the guest, and then the resource tenant, that's where they've been invited into. And then once that invite is sent to them, then they reclaim the invite, and then they're going to be able to be authorized as a guest in your resource tenant. So because you don't control the authentication portion of this, guests are really meant to be like very, very locked down users. So like they really come with virtually no out-of-the-box privileges at all. So they really should do less than an out-of-the-box standard user even. There's a whole website that's I've linked to here describing exactly what the out-of-the-box privileges are for guests. And so once you've invited someone into your directory, they look like this. In the bottom right, there is something we can see where the B2B invitations status has been set to accepted. So, okay, we've gone a little bit into the weeds, but hopefully for some of you this isn't too unfamiliar. This is where maybe the wheels come off the bus a little bit. Certainly it caused a lot of head scratching for us when we were in this. So when we get into billing agreements, there is a little bit weird behavior. So let's first of all touch on what a billing agreement is and why you need to know about this to understand weird guest behavior in Azure. So billing agreements are the way that you get billed in Azure. There's two main real like common ones. There's like a whole bunch of more obscure ones, but the two big ones that you'll see is enterprise agreements and the Microsoft customer agreements, which is the kind of like new modern way to do things. Basically, at the very top of the hierarchy, you've got your actual kind of contract with Microsoft. And then in both models, there's like a slightly different way of kind of organizing things and like where you actually attach like the credit card. For the Microsoft customer agreement, you kind of attach your credit card to a billing profile at the top, and then you kind of have these invoice sections, which are kind of like useful organizational structures like inside of your billing profile. It's a little bit different with enterprise agreement, but a very similar thing. And then ultimately, anything that gets spun up inside of your subscription is then going to be billed to that attached billing account. So that's how subscriptions start linking with these billing models. So you can see that with certain kind of billing role permissions, we actually get the ability to create subscriptions. So for Microsoft customer agreements, we actually just need owner or contributor at any of one of these levels, and then we get the ability to create subscriptions. And there's also a specific billing role of like subscription creator that we can be assigned. And all of those lead to us being able to create subscriptions. For enterprise agreements, again, very similar. Pretty much, if you have admin at any one of these levels, you can then create subscriptions. So this then, to jump back to kind of Microsoft documentation, this comes from Microsoft's website documentation, and this kind of really shows you how to think about these three different worlds and how these different permissions and privileges are like working together. So we've got the directory, the tenant at the very top. You see that's linking to then from Entra ID to then the world of Azure resources with management groups, and then the subscriptions all beneath them. And then off as a kind of weird sidecar, we've got the kind of enterprise agreement or Microsoft customer agreement, generally the billing account. And you can see that how the subscriptions get inserted into the world of Azure resources. So now we kind of got a bit of a picture of how these things work. Let's get into what was previously undocumented behavior. So I was very shocked, and after a lot of fiddling around as to why this partner was seeing a guest that had managed to make a subscription, we finally figured out this, which is that when you have guest federation happening into your tenant, your billing permissions kind of work across tenants. And I've deliberately drawn the graph this way, where the billing role allows you to create a subscription in your home directory or in a resource directory, and not that you get somehow the billing role when you're like federated as a guest. So the weird thing is that this doesn't work if I go log in as a guest into the resource tenant. I have to be in my home tenant, but then I'm in my home tenant and I'm allowed to make a subscription into the resource tenant that I can federate into. I can choose. So if you're a little bit confused, it's just this simple thing. When I'm creating a subscription, you just click the advanced tab, and then there's a drop down, and you can choose whichever directory that you have access to, be that a home tenant or a resource tenant. And so then once you've done it in your home tenant, and then you go back and federate in, now you are like the owner of a subscription. So you can see we've got the RBAC role, and we're the owner of this subscription that we made in the step prior. And then this ends up looking like this. So mystery solved. We figured out how the guest managed to make their subscription. So just to recap the steps involved, the attacker is assigned a billing role in their home tenant. The attacker is then invited into the resource tenant as a B2B guest. And then the exploit is that then the attacker can create a subscription in that resource tenant. And so in terms of like defenders and other people think about the threat model, this really is that any B2B guest federating into your tenant is now a possible vector. So with this, we were pretty excited. We went over and spoke to Microsoft, and as is a bit of a rite of passage of being an Azure / Microsoft security researcher, they told us it is a feature and not a bug. At the time of the meeting, they said that there was no controls to prevent this kind of behavior. They have since updated that, and I'm gonna be a responsible researcher and try and link you guys to that, so you know what is the Microsoft's recommended best practice now. But they kind of were really wanted to reassure us that don't worry, subscriptions are a security boundary in Azure. And so, you don't need to worry about this very much. And so obviously I just went, fair enough, and left it at that and didn't go any further. No, I wanted to see whether we could abuse this because I wasn't so sure that defenders can just kind of easily just dismiss this as a threat. So in terms of if we're going to really need to abuse this, we're going to have to step up our game a little bit. First of all, we're going to need a reliable attack vector. So the first of all thing to overcome is like, how do we get this like billing permission? How do we get this like billing role that we need? So we can get it in about 5 minutes. We just sign up for an Azure free trial. So once we sign up for an Azure free trial, we are now the billing admin of this Entra ID tenant that gets like spun up associated with this trial. So we're now a billing admin. We've got these special billing admin permissions that we need. The next thing that we're going to need to do to take advantage of this attack is to figure out how we can be a guest in someone's environment. So the nice thing is that we can take advantage of some default settings. So by default, if you've done nothing to change this in your environment, any user, including guests themselves, can invite other guests into the directory. So that means if we have access to any kind of account, be it a user or guest, we can now just go invite in the billing admin that we just spun up in the previous step. So now we're a guest and we've got our billing admin permissions. So we can now create these subscriptions. But we like run into our next problem, which is that our subscriptions are empty, right? And this is kind of like the really weird, unique privilege model that we're in within this attack. So we have managed to get like ourselves to be owner of the subscription, but it's empty. So we're like king of the castle, but the castle is like empty. And like all of the interesting targets, like key vaults and things like that, are all sitting off in like other subscriptions that like we don't have any kind of RBAC role over. And so kind of seems like game over. There's like different failed ways that I tried to kind of like leverage this. So first thing was like, do subscriptions really act as a security boundary? And like from a very kind of obvious thing, like they do, right? Like you can't just go from being the owner of a subscription and kind of try and get access to another subscription directly just by being virtue of being an owner of a different subscription. The worst you can do is kind of request like ownership being transferred, but that requires someone to approve it on the other side. So it's not really an abuse of any kind of significance, in my opinion. The other thing that doesn't work, and that is very important to clarify about this kind of abuse, is that as the guest, we are charged back to like our billing accounts from the like tied to our like home directory. This is like the whole point of the feature is that you can have subscriptions that are living in one directory but billed to a different like directory. So we can't use this to offload costs. It's like we can't like spin up a whole bunch of crypto mining and hope that the resource tenant is going to get charged for that. We'll just get charged for that. So anything like on that like doesn't work. But that does sort of give us like a bit of an advantage. And when I started doing some more digging, I did realize that there was some things that we could take advantage of. So the first thing that took me an embarrassingly long amount of time to do was to click on the access control for the subscription that the guest controls. And then like up popped all of these different users and service principals. And I thought this was just an empty subscription. So I was like, where the heck did all of these security principles come from? And now, hopefully you guys put a little pin in your head of that like detail I was giving you before of that management groups sit above subscriptions and are used for management of all of your subscriptions. So if any admin in the resource tenant has given an RBAC role scoped to the root management group, that's going to get inherited into every single subscription. And this is a really common practice, right? For any kind of inventory, say applications where they're going to just like constantly look at all the different Azure resources that you spin up. They'll be given like, say, a reader RBAC role at the root management group level. Has other reasons, like we see in here, there's like key vault readers. There's a whole plethora of reasons as to why you might set up this. It is a very common practice. And so, yeah, as you can see, this is how this works. We're getting our role is being inherited of the actual admins that we're managing to enumerate out. Those are being inherited from the root management groups. Interestingly, when I was like reverse engineering the UI display comes from 2 API endpoints. So it first of all does a lookup on the like Azure Resource Management endpoint, and it gets the role assignments, and then from that gives like principal IDs and the principal type, and then it uses that to go do lookups of those IDs. And like Entra ID's got a bit of a funny thing in terms of like the Microsoft graph, where it's like by default, like if you know the UUID of an object, you're allowed to like look it up, because it's kind of like, it's sort of like uses the assumption that that's sort of a secret, that you know the UUID, so you're allowed to go get the details of it. And so actually, interestingly, for this enumeration abuse tactic, there's only a partial defense to this, because there is a setting that can control this, but it only controls the lookup portion. So those role assignments, like you can't change any controls to stop actually getting the principal ID, only the lookup portion where you use the principal ID to get the actual name and the email address. But the principal ID is all we need to do RBAC role assignments ourselves. So now we've got those principal IDs, we can start assigning the users that we enumerated out RBAC roles onto our subscription. And why would we want to do that? Well, probably for camouflage, right? Now, instead of just having just our weird guest user having an RBAC role of this subscription, now suddenly legitimate users have our RBAC roles over our subscription. So any defender looking at this might think, hey, this is kind of like a legitimate subscription. So let's see if we can keep on taking this up a notch. So that was kind of like as far as I got for a good while on this abuse. And then I went down a whole fun rabbit hole of devices. And so this is where I get to explain to you a little bit about what devices are. So devices are a key part of Azure's idea of zero trust. So basically, one of their primary roles is to be used as a key signal in conditional access policies. So the idea is that like an organization is maybe going to trust me more if I'm on a joined and compliant device, say my laptop. They know about this device, it has a device identity. It's also, say managed in terms of compliance by a solution like Intune or other like MDM solutions. And so that then we can then use these conditional access policies to say, hey, don't give access to unjoined, uncompliant devices, but if a user's on a compliant managed device, then sure, give them access to whatever we're wanting to target with that conditional access policy. And there are a few really important security implications of devices and things that have device identities. So joined devices get issued primary refresh tokens. And primary refresh tokens, for those not in the world of Azure security research, these are big targets for attackers. The reason why they're big targets is because they are tokens that we can use to mint refresh tokens and access tokens. They are long-lived and they're valid for up to like 90 days if we keep on using them. And once we have one, right, we can mint refresh tokens and access tokens to all the different like resources in Azure. So there's a really great write-up by the one and only Dr. Azure AD. He is a bit of a genius when it comes to Entra ID security. So definitely recommend his write-up. So let's see if we can get one. So how would we get one in our model of things? We can actually, we can make virtual machines, because those are just an Azure resource. And when we make an Azure resource, there is the option to give it the extension of basically Entra ID-based Windows logging. So rather than doing something horribly insecure, like, managing our own credentials and things like this, we can say, hey, I want to give access to this VM of one of my Entra ID users, and I'm just going to let them log in via their like Entra ID credentials. So I don't have to worry about like managing a bunch of credentials. So seems more secure, which is great. How this works under the hood is that this VM is now going to get a device identity. Interestingly, by default, any users can join devices into Entra ID, but there is the option to say none, and that setting doesn't prevent installing this extension and getting a device identity. So while you might say like, haha, like I'm very cautious defender, I don't allow users to join devices. That's actually not gonna stop us getting this joint device anyway. And we don't even need like VMs that have these compatible extensions. If you want to do the extension manually yourself, it's really just about setting a few registry settings and then running this dsreg command with the right input, and then we're going to get a VM with a device identity. So here you can see we have a device. It is joined to Entra ID. So the reason why this is like significant is, one, because if we join this virtual machine, if we delete this virtual machine, its device identity is still going to persist. So when we do this as an attacker and we make this virtual machine, we've essentially inserted a device identity backdoor. And why is having a device identity backdoor important? Well, because devices can be used for phishing. Remember, I said that devices will be issued primary refresh tokens, but only joined devices will get primary refresh tokens. And so because I'm the owner of this VM, I can make my VM with no trusted platform module protections, and I have, as the creator of the VM, I get the local admin credentials to this VM, which means that I can strip away all of the protections that would normally prevent device identities from being harvested from the machine. And so that means I get the device identity pub and priv key, and there I'm using AED internals to do that. And then from that, this then opens up this attack path, where you can see here, I'm the threat actor. I do my whole initial first thing of like signing up for a Microsoft account, and then federating in as a guest, making my subscription, stealing the device identity. And then the only new part is that we go device code phishing for a specific kind of refresh token. So this does rely on a specific technique that was written by Dirk-Jan Malema, absolute. He's the goat of blowing up Entra ID. And what he found is that there's a very specific kind of refresh token that you can request, which is used in the process of device registration, which you can actually upgrade a refresh token to a primary refresh token. It's like the token that gets used when you're like initially onboarding the device. And so we can go fish for that specific kind of refresh token and then combine that with our device identity, and that is the method of upgrading requires us to have the device identity. And so that's why it's important that from the previous step that we can insert in these device backdoors. And so obviously that does make it like a post-compromise attack. I do want to point out that this exact technique of the primary refresh token upgrade is being used in the wild at the moment. Microsoft did a whole write-up about it. There's a lot of Russian APT like actors using this at the moment, as well as like ransomware folks. So this really isn't like some theoretical like abuse in terms of that, and everything else we got for free in terms of just being able to make subscriptions as a privileged kind of guest. And so this is how we would do it using RowTX. It's a popular Python library for doing these kinds of things. And you can see here, once we've done our device code fish and we've got like our our refresh token, we can then use that to upgrade to a PRT. And once we've got that, remember we were enumerating out admins of the management group. So those are people who very likely are going to have global admin level. One of the primary ways that admins end up at the management group level is when they assign themselves subscription access to all subscriptions, and they'll get inherited in. So we are in the position of targeting the most high profile, most privileged users. And then once we've got that primary refresh token, we're in to any service. So that's cool. We can also do a couple of other kind of related but different attacks. So we could also spin up our VM and try and get like one of the admins that we enumerate out to log into the VM. So maybe we send them a Teams message if our initial kind of user that we managed to compromise has Teams access, and we try and get our admin to log into a VM. Hey, I'm really sorry. I'm struggling to log into my VM. I don't know why it's working. It's supposed to work with Entra ID login. Can you get it to work, kind of thing? People think, well, hey, I'm logging in a completely secure way using their credentials. We grant the login access. We can even do it the secure way, which is using a bastion, which actually is the easiest way to do it from an attacker point of view. And it's nice because any admin would think that someone's being quite responsible in how they've set up. They haven't opened up any RDP ports to the internet, but we can do it the kind of old-fashioned way. There's a few annoying problems to overcome. There's a great write-up by this guy who kind of showed how we can set up VMs to do Entra ID login. So all of this is really good. Hopefully some of the defenders are getting a little bit worried. I'm just going to worry you just a little bit more. So some of you might be thinking, okay, it's not too bad because everything's gonna look like it's like this. There's going to be this weird user that a little bit of research, instant response is going to show us that like, hey, there's like a guest owner, and that kind of inherently looks suspicious, right? Like a guest owner of the subscription, that's like a bit weird. So there's a few things we can do about that as an attacker. So the first, which I found this really ironic and quite kind of fun, is that there are defender alerts that go off saying that, hey, guest accounts with owner permissions are on Azure resources. And this is on the subscription, so the highest level of like a kind of Azure resource. But because I'm the subscription owner, I get to switch this off because all of the defender alerts are tied to the subscription. So I just say like, yeah, it's all good. I know that I am the subject of this alert, but I'm just gonna switch this off. So that's really useful. But like for you skeptics out there, you'd be right to point out some of these things, which is that like, hang on, like it could well be the defenders aren't just relying on Defender, right? Like they've probably got a whole bunch of other SIM tools and other things that say looking for guests being owners of Azure resources. So how could we have a kind of a foolproof method of silencing alerts? So to kind of really do this properly, we want to kind of persist as a different security principle. We want to like retain all of the same like privileges that we had, and then ideally kind of disappear as a guest. And we can do that. So we can use managed identities. So managed identities are a special kind of service principle. And so basically, they're a service principle when we have Azure resources and we want to give them an identity. So say we want to give like our virtual machine an identity. So we want to give any kind of Azure resource can potentially have this service principle identity kind of glued onto it. Works in an interesting way with Fabric, but I won't get into that right now. And so you can see, like the basic idea is like, okay, as my guest, I'm the owner of the subscription. I can create VMs. I can then attach a managed identity to that. And now that managed identity is going to be represented as this like service principle. So we're starting to pivot away, right? Like we've now inserted a proper security principle, not a weird one like a device, but like a proper security principle. Also, service principals don't have MFA safeguards, right? So that's nice. So we pivoted away to a security principle that doesn't have MFA protection. And we can make this even worse because we can actually give federated credentials to managed identities. And what that's going to mean is that we actually spin up a little attacker-controlled OIDC provider. So something that speaks OIDC, there is red team tools in order to do this, where it's just an OIDC provider that doesn't really do any actual checks, and it just says, yep, this person's good to go, you can log them in. And what that's doing like behind the scenes is it's offloading to the OIDC provider the responsibility of doing the authentication part. And so now we've got a proper backdoor set up because we can just access the system directly now from this like service principal. We just go to that service principal, it goes and speaks to our attacker-controlled OIDC provider. That says, yeah, hey, that service principal is authenticated. And then we get an ID token that we can then go use to be authorized in the directory. So we've got our persistence. We can then give this service principal our RBAC role of owner. So we can now keep all of the privileges that we had before. But we've got this one last little touch. And so one last little fun. This was the final thing that of research I did on this, and I was happy because it felt like a little bit of a cherry on top, which is that we can actually make use of one last default setting, which is guests are allowed to uninvite themselves from the directory. And so basically, we can do all of the shenanigans, set up our device backdoor, our managed identity backdoor, give our managed identity the access of like the subscription owner, and then we can just like piece from the directory as the guests themselves. And I tried this to see if there would be any kind of like artifacts left over. And no, like as a defender, when I try and look up that user, it just says no user exists. So all of the alerts, anything that was like scoped to, hey, this guest has some weird access that they shouldn't, will now just be silenced because that guest doesn't exist anymore. But as an attacker, we have managed to persist and we still have a bunch of access to this. And this is all we have to do. We just have to go to this portal to like uninvite ourselves. So as Microsoft didn't want to fix this, I thought it would be a little bit fun to release this as an offensive toolkit. So for any folks that are interested, go to this GitHub and you can see all the API calls if you're just interested in all the API calls. It does a few fun things for you. I will do a quick demo of just one of them. Here it's like creating a subscription and then you're asked what kind of invoice section. It goes and looks up your invoice sections, ask which one you want to like create it inside of. And then I think shortly, yeah, there you go. It created the subscription. Here's an example of it making a VM. I think. Yeah, here we go. So it is a bit of an involved process to getting everything right to do the VM setup. So the nice thing is the offensive toolkit does all of that for you. And so you can see it going through, getting all of the settings right and doing everything on the user's behalf so that they can get one of these, what I like to call an evil VM for the device backdoor. And boom, there you go. So in terms of all the commands that you can run with this like offensive toolkit, these are the different things that you can do. I think from having successfully scared Microsoft a little bit with some of these shenanigans, they have now started to update their documentation, which I'm really happy about because ultimately I do just want people to be secure in their Azure environments. So they now say this: authorized users, including guest users in your directory, can create Azure subscriptions in another directory where they have billing permissions and then transfer those subscriptions into your Entra ID directory. If you don't want to allow this, you should set one or both of the following policies. So I think this is like a lot better that they're like acknowledging that this behavior still exists. I still do have a few qualms in just that like use of the authorized users. I do hope that if you've got one thing from this talk, it's that we didn't authorize the user to do any of this in our resource directory. They just used their authorization from their home directory. So while it's maybe technically correct, I do think that part's still a little bit misleading, but I'm happy to see that they're starting to acknowledge the threat of this. In terms of defense, really prevention is key. There's like 3 big policies that I want to just quickly take you through that is going to be key here. This is part of the offensive toolkit. Attackers won't be able to run this command, but you can just figure out these these policies as an attacker by just trying the attacks and see what works. The first thing that we're going to do is the root cause, which is stopping these subscriptions being transferred into the directory. So actually what's happening under the hood is these subscriptions are being made in the home directory and they're being transferred into the resource directory. And so this setting here that Microsoft's now linking people to stops that. So I would definitely recommend you changing that from the default, which is allow anybody to transfer subscriptions into your directory to no one, and then just permit specific users if you do have that use case. That is really the single best thing you can do as a defender. Other things that you can do is just generally go to these external collaboration settings and just harden everything as best as you can. As I said before, there's not a full protection for the enum thing, but the changing the user access restrictions, setting that to the most restrictive means that at least they can't do the lookup part of that. And then I probably wouldn't recommend not allowing people to uninvite themselves. That's kind of nice because people clean up as they go, but it is just worth knowing from your kind of instant response kind of point of view that if you had a weird alert flash up and then disappear, it could be because that's what's happened. So yeah, maybe just keep that in mind. And then in terms of other just kind of general things to be aware of, MFA via conditional access is always a good thing for guests. Just generally monitoring guest-made subscriptions, you might see these things fly up. Broad dynamic device groups, those can be important because we can brute force getting into these device groups if it's just hey, all devices that have the name Madrid something. That's a common thing I've seen in Defender's environments where they're using office locations and they're actually using device groups kind of based on just simplistic rules. So you might want to just think about that. And then hardening root management group policies is probably a sensible thing to do, not having it so that that people can make generation 1 virtual machines that have got the TPM protections disabled, so that stops people being able to export device identity certificates and also primary refresh tokens off of the virtual machines. And generally, audit devices, which I don't think is something any defender that I've spoken to does very well. And I think most people find that they've just got thousands and thousands of devices in their environment and with no understanding of which ones are actually being used. So it might be something I blog about later. So in conclusion, the B2B guest threat model I don't think is well understood. The defaults are very, very insecure. By default, all of this behavior is allowed. All of the settings that I took advantage of were all the default settings for all the attacks. So there was no special configuration to allow any of this stuff. But if you then go and change those, hardening does work. And with that, I will turn over to any questions if we have time.